Hello, and welcome back to part 3 of the Gauge Month YouTube series. Today is definitely going to be one to watch. One quick reminder before we hop in. At the end of March, I will be hosting a low-fee workshop on how to use Gauge to modify a pattern to your body. The link to sign up is in the description below. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future educational crochet videos. I am always being asked what to do if you can get the stitch gauge but not the row gauge, or the row gauge but not the stitch gauge. Today you will have all the answers and the confidence to get gauge perfect every single time. I cannot stress enough how important it is to get your gauge as close to the pattern as possible. Even being off by half a stitch can really throw off the fit of a garment. Each person crochets slightly differently. Each yarn works up slightly differently. Your tension can change based on your mood. There are just so many factors that can affect gauge. I am a firm believer if you have the right weight of yarn, you can achieve any gauge with a couple easy tweaks. Here comes my teacher voice. You need to be using the right weight of yarn to achieve the gauge in the pattern. You cannot change the weight of yarn and expect the garment to have the same drape with the same gauge, or to achieve a different gauge with a different weight of yarn and make a different size while expecting the proportions of the garment to work out correctly. I get this question a lot. Can I make this DK pattern with a worsted weight instead? No. Full stop. If you want a worsted weight sweater, you need to find a pattern that uses worsted weight yarn. It just doesn't work like that. Sorry, but not really sorry. Okay, back to it. When we have made a swatch that has the incorrect gauge, it is incredibly important to only change one factor at a time. For example, only change your hook size. Don't also change the yarn. Changing only one variable at a time is going to help us figure out exactly how to get gauge just right. The first goal when swatching is to achieve the correct number of stitches wide your swatch needs to be when it's blocked. And yes, you always need to assume that the gauge in the pattern is blocked. More on this in next week's video. To get the correct number of stitches wide in a swatch, my recommendation is to just adjust your hook size. If you have too many stitches in a 4-inch section of your swatch, this means that your gauge is tighter, your stitches are tighter than the designer, and therefore you should go up in hook size. You need to use a larger hook. If you have too few stitches in a 4-inch section of your swatch, this means your stitches are too loose, or they're looser than the designer's, and you need to go down in hook size. Use a smaller hook. How much you should change your hook size depends on how far off your gauge is. If it's off by a half a stitch or maybe a stitch or two, I'd probably only go up or down one hook size. But if you're off by something like 4 stitches, you might need to jump up 2 or more hook sizes. For example, for these 3 swatches, I used the same yarn and the same style of hook, but I just used one smaller and one larger hook than I did for the one in the center. You can see as the hook size goes up, the swatch gets bigger, and there are fewer stitches and rows in any 4-inch section, and vice versa as the hook size goes down. The differences are small, but that's good because it helps us to get gauge perfect when we're able to change our stitch and row height by only a fraction by switching hooks. I also recommend using the same type of hook when you're going up and down in hook size. For example, if the head of your hook is shaped different, if the throat or the shank of your hook is shaped differently, or if your hook is made of a different material, like wood versus metal versus plastic, it will all affect your gauge. Remember, we are trying to isolate one factor at a time. So if we change the hook size, we shouldn't also change the hook material or shape in the same test swatch. Now let's look at some examples. Here I used the same yarn, tensioned it in my fingers the same way, and made them all right after one another. But I used 4 different styles of hooks and got swatches that are slightly different. I made one with my typical hook, a tapered metal hook, one with a tapered wooden hook, one with a straight metal hook, and one with a straight bamboo hook. Again, the differences are very subtle, Some are only a fraction of a stitch taller or a fraction of a stitch wider, but these little differences add up over the course of a whole garment. This can also happen when you switch fibers. Cotton yarn will work up differently than acrylic, which is different than wool, which is different than bamboo. And we're going to dive more into fibers and gauge in next week's video about blocking your gauge swatches, as that's when we start to see the biggest differences between fibers. Well, what happens if you achieve the proper number of rows, the height, but not the proper number of stitches, width? Or you have the right number of stitches, width, but not the right number of rows, height. First, you're going to want to use the hook that gets you the right number of stitches wide, width, because stitch width is harder to manipulate than stitch height. After you've achieved the right number of stitches wide in your blocked swatch, you're going to manipulate what is called the golden loop. The golden loop is the loop at the bottom of the stitch, the one that you pull through the stitch of the previous row or round. And it is what determines the height of your stitch. Just like gauge overall, golden loop can be affected by so many factors, particularly how we hold our hooks, whether we hold it like a knife or like a pencil, and how tight or loose we tension our yarn. Let me show you how to adjust your golden loop. I'm starting the swatches in this part of the tutorial a few rows in, only because it is easier for you to see the manipulation I am doing to the golden loop. You should be adjusting your golden loop the same in every row or round though, right from row 1. In all of the swatches I'm going to show you, let's assume I have already met the stitch gauge, but my row gauge is off, as this is what you should be doing too. Let's say you're not getting enough rows in your 4-inch square. This means you have a naturally taller golden loop than the designer. This is okay. You're just going to have to adjust it for this design in order to meet gauge. To shorten your golden loop, you need to pull tighter on the first loop that is drawn through the previous row or round. You can also try to tilt your hook down a little bit or not pull it up so far when you're pulling through that first loop. Then you work the remainder of your stitch as normal, making sure to not pull the top of that stitch tighter. And you repeat this for every stitch in your swatch and every stitch in your garment. Now let's say you're getting too many rows in your 4-inch square, which means your golden loop is naturally shorter than the designer. In this case, you're going to need to pull the golden loop up a little bit and do your best to not pull so hard on the yarn during the creation of that part of the stitch. Here is how you can pull that loop up. And again, you need to try your best to keep this consistent across all the stitches in your swatch and all the stitches in the project you're making. It will feel very strange at first, but over time it will become more natural and it will speed up a little bit for you. Again, here are the 3 swatches I made with the same yarn. The swatch in the middle is my natural stitching. The swatch on the left, I pulled the golden loop tighter, and the swatch on the right, I elongated the golden loop by pulling up on it. You'll notice that all 3 swatches are the same width, but they're different heights. This is why I said to get the correct stitch gauge first, and then begin manipulating the golden loop. And that's the golden loop. Remember, the rule is if you have too few rows, shorten the golden loop. If you have too many rows, lengthen the golden loop. And that's it. That is how you adjust your gauge. And this applies to all yarn weights and all fiber types. Each will act slightly differently, but you will always use the same methods to achieve proper gauge. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for future educational content. And click below if you'd like to sign up for my workshop on how to use gauge to modify patterns to your body. See you next week!